after the first 30 minutes, I will leave the floor to the first group for their presentation, and then I will have another 30 minutes and then leave the floor to the second group for their presentation. Today we have a first group on just let me check. One group is on the Crédit Agricole case, and the second group is on the SREP ECB results of 2020. Okay, so the MiFID II, you know what we're talking about. This is a set of slides that was prepared by Isadora Tarola, who is the head of market surveillance at Consob. She actually came to class a couple of times over the past 2 years to deliver this lecture on trading venues. And this year I'm taking up her presentation that I have slightly amended and updated just to take into account the most recent developments. And you already know that trading venues is the second part of the MiFID package, and it is quite comprehensive because this part of the regulation has been expanded quite a lot from MiFID I to MiFID II. And in effect, if you look at what we now have in place, it's quite a staggering number of provisions distributed among level 1 and level 2 of the MiFID package. Obviously, I do not assume that you would remember all of these delegated regulations by heart, but just to give you just a visual impact on how complex the regulation of trading venues is within the MiFID package. You have level 1, which is our directive that you know pretty well by now, and the accompanying MiFID regulation. And then you have all of these delegated regulations, and then you have ESMA's guidelines and Q&As. In particular, Q&As are constantly updated in the area of trading venues and as well, not just investment services, but also trading venues. MiFID II had an impact, a quite significant impact on the regulation of trading venues. And vis-a-vis MiFID I, this regulation has truly become more invasive, more comprehensive, and more complex to understand. The reasons behind this sort of revamping of the MiFID approach to the trading venues are set out in this slide. From MiFID I to MiFID II, we saw a number of phenomena coming up that required a new legislative approach. Market microstructures have evolved. New trading systems have developed after MiFID I, and these are now captured by MiFID II, such as the organized trading facility. We have new entities. We had new entities operating on trading venues, adapting more complex and significant new strategies, such as algo and high-frequency trading. New risks have emerged, basically because of technological evolution. Risk for regulatory arbitrage was increasing because of different implementation of rules and requirements across different trading venues, and insufficient transparency for non-equity financial instruments that were only in part regulated by MiFID I, and market fragmentation needed to be addressed. So these were the big forces behind the review of MiFID I. What we see clearly in MiFID II is that regulation, the legislative side of regulating trading venues is increasing. There are a lot of areas that before were left to the autonomy of trading venues, and that are now actually within the boundary of MiFID II and public regulation. What I mean by that is clearly referred to how trading venues are effectively structured and how they function. Because what you should always keep in mind is that each trading venue ultimately has its own internal rules. And these rules regulate all sorts of aspects, such as access to the trading venue by issuers, by market participants, rules on the formation of contracts, on the combination of orders. Now, all of these elements are left. This was the case in MiFID I, and in part it is also under MiFID II. All of these rules are to be found in the trading venue's rule book, the internal rules of each trading venue. And each trading venue has its own internal rules, which are set out in these rule books. Okay, before MiFID I, before MiFID II, there was much more autonomy, there was much more freedom for the trading venues to draft these rule books according to their own needs and criteria. And as a result of this, the fragmentation and the diversification of the rules among different trading venues was very high in the context of MiFID I. And when a trading venue, such as a stock exchange, a regulated market, and an MTF drafts these internal rule books, it needs to consider various aspects. It needs to consider, for instance, its own business model. Trading venues are commercial entities. They are there to provide a service on the market and ultimately to make a profit out of it. So they have different business models. You have trading venues that are clearly oriented towards big corporations, such as regulated markets. You have trading venues that target small, medium-sized enterprises. You have trading venues that are more specific in terms of financial instruments. For instance, you have trading venues that specialize in emissions tradings, in derivatives, in debt securities. And the regulation of the trading venue reflects the equilibrium between different components. On the one side, these rule books tend to favor new business coming up by sort of stimulating issuers to access that trading venue, to have their securities traded on that particular trading venue. On the other side, they must take into account the need of protecting investors and to provide sufficient transparency, to have mechanisms in force that confirm that the trading venue is safe and that it works in an efficient way. And then it also has to take into account its own interests and its own duties. A trading venue is subject to various kinds of supervisions under MiFID, and it is also one of the key entry points of the market abuse regulation controls. So you have to put all of these three things together, and you end up by having very different approaches to the concrete functioning of the trading venues. Now, before MiFID II, there were lots of topics that within this approach were left to the autonomy of each trading venue. For instance, the fee structure, the fees that are levied by the trading venue upon issuers or upon brokers that are members of the stock exchange, the size of the tick, the so-called tick size, which is the minimum amount of the order that can be placed on a trading venue, which seems to be pretty technical or trivial topic of tick sizes. Why should you be concerned with tick sizes? Well, it's not. It is technical, but it's very important because the tick size influences the microstructure of the trading venue. So it has an impact on how the trading venue actually functions and is structured. So there were a lot of areas that were left to the autonomy of the trading venue before MiFID II and that are now instead regulated by the directive. So we clearly see that there is an expansion of public regulation in the area of trading venues vis-a-vis the approach of MiFID I. Also, new technologies have developed over time, and there are comprehensive rules in MiFID II that we will briefly look at today that touch upon algo trading and by high-frequency trading, on algo trading and high-frequency trading, that clearly reflect the technological evolution and a system that was not in place in the context of MiFID I. MiFID II would like to provide a more coherent regulatory approach on trading venues regulation. It would like to reduce the risks of regulatory arbitrage, which means treating one trading venue differently from another one, and take into account the development of new trading systems that were unknown to MiFID I. So all of this results ultimately in three basic points. The first one is that in MiFID II we have a new trading venue, which is now included in the scope of this part of the directive, and these are the so-organized trading facilities, OTFs. The second consequence is that we have a new polishing the definition of a systematic internalizer. We already saw what a systematic internalizer is, but I will go back on this and re-elaborate a little bit on what we saw at the beginning of the part of the course on MiFID II. And then we find the tendency to provide common rules to the three different trading venues that are now regulated by MiFID II: regulated markets, multilateral trading facilities, and organized trading facilities. This is a very interesting slide. I think it's very useful because it gives you the historical evolution of the regulation of trading venues from the ISD to MiFID II. And it focuses in particular also on the concentration rule that you remember was one of the core elements of the then existing regulation under the ISD directive in 1993. And that's in some way now reintroduced, but with a different name. It is now called trading obligation by MiFID II. In this slide, you sort of find everything that we've been sort of discussing from a historical perspective, from the ISD introduction of the notion of regulated markets, of the first core of rules on the transparency of trading venues, MiFID I, the elimination of the concentration rule, introduction of multilateral trading facilities alongside regulated markets, so new trading venues that come into the scope of EU legislation, MTFs, which is not at that point anymore limited to regulated markets, and then MiFID II, MiFIR, where we have a new trading venue regulated in the directive, with the so-called OTFs, and wider transparency rules for the functioning and reporting requirements of trading venues, and the introduction of a trading obligation for equities and derivatives. So this is, I think this is a very useful slide because it just sort of sums up everything that we've been seeing that you will see, including today, in terms of evolution of the system from the ISD of 1993 to what we now play MiFID II. Now, the next step will obviously be the impact of blockchain and distributed ledger technology in the context of regulation of trading venues, and this is now being considered in the new digital finance package. That is a very interesting proposal that we will discuss again in the 2 lessons on fintech regulation that we will have during the course. But it is not in place yet. It has not been approved yet. But we will see further evolutions on the regulation of trading venues as a consequence of the introduction of these new technologies on the market. What MiFID II gives us today is the following landscape, the following taxonomy of trading and execution venues. And more precisely, just to clarify what I have been saying, in MiFID II you find 3 different trading venues which fall within the scope of the directive: regulated markets, MTFs, and OTFs. These are properly called trading venues, and this is an expression that, as you might remember, is limited to multilateral trading systems, whereby systematic internalizers are excluded from the broader definition of trading venues. They are called simply an execution venue. Now, because systematic internalizers are bilateral, they are not multilateral, but ultimately, if you look at this distinction, doesn't make much sense in my view. It is based on a structural difference between these trading venues that you see on the slide and systematic internalizers. The difference is that here we have a multilateral system, and on the other side we have a bilateral system. But ultimately, if you then look at on the one side, the functions that trading venues and execution venues perform, they are the same. The functions are price formation and liquidity and liquidity on the market, and this is applicable both to trading venues and execution venues. And also the rules that MiFID II applies to systematic internalizers in terms of transparency, structural aspects, are pretty close to the ones that are applicable to trading venues. So my personal opinion is that this distinction is artificial. It simply reflects the fact that one thing is multilateral, another thing is bilateral, but ultimately you end up by having similar functions provided to the market and rules applicable that are not so different in the 2 circumstances. But let us go back to the definition of the 3 multilateral trading venues. Now, you can look at these definitions by considering, first of all, regulated markets and MTFs. These are multilateral and non-discretionary. If you read the definition carefully, you will see that it's basically the same definition for regulated markets and MTFs, and the definition is based on the idea that these 2 trading venues are multilateral and non-discretional. What does non-discretionality actually mean? It means that in these 2 trading venues, the market operator, the entity that builds up the infrastructure, that manages the trading venue, does not intervene, simply sets down the rules for the functioning of the system, but then the orders are treated and they are matched by the system itself on an automatic basis. There is no intervention in the execution of orders phase by the market operator. They are non-discretional. This is a core feature, very important for you to remember, both of regulated markets and MTFs. They are multilateral and non-discretional. On the other side, organized trading facilities are always multilateral, but they are discretional. And if you look at the slide, there is a part in red which says execution of orders on OTFs is carried out on a discretionary basis, which means that the market operator may decide when to place or retract an order on the OTF. It may decide not to match a specific client order with other client orders available in the system at a given time, provided it is in compliance with instructions received from a client. So OTFs have an element of discretionality that is unknown for regulated markets and multilateral trading facilities. So basically that's the difference between the first two and the third trading venue. But what is the difference between a regulated market and an MTF? I assume you remember this because we discussed it at the beginning of the MiFID part. The distinction is something that has little to do with MiFID II. It lies in other directives of the European Union. We have a bunch of other directives, in fact, that are applicable only to issuers whose securities are traded on regulated markets. And this is generally what we call in literature listed companies. Listed companies usually refers to companies whose shares or bonds or securities are listed on regulated markets. Now, these listed companies are subject to other directives of the European Union, such as the Takeover Directive, the Transparency Directive, the Shareholders' Rights Directive, that are only applicable to companies who get their securities traded on regulated markets. And this is why in MiFID II, regulated markets maintain this special status that ultimately doesn't make any difference. If you look at how the trading venue works, there is no difference between a regulated market and an MTF, but there is a difference in terms of the entity that can set up and manage a regulated market vis-à-vis an MTF or an OTF. A regulated market, in fact, because of its special status under other European directives, not under MiFID, but under other European directives, may only be set up and managed by a specialized market operator that gets a license under MiFID II, but it is a license as a regulated market operator. Instead, MTFs and OTFs may be managed by investment firms, including credit institutions, and may also be managed by a regulated market operator. Okay, but an investment firm or a credit institution may not set up and manage a regulated market, because that is an area which is treated separately under MiFID II. The rules on the structure of the market are exactly the same as to those applicable to MTFs, but simply the entity that gets that kind of authorization needs to be a specialized entity. It cannot simply be an investment firm or a credit institution. Systematic internalizers, instead, we already saw this in the definitions when we sort of looked at the definitions of investment services under MiFID I. Just to recap, it is an investment firm that deals on account, so it's bilateral, it deals on own account and executes orders outside a regulated market or an MTF or an OTF on a systematic, organized, frequent and substantial basis. And it is bilateral, and the definition of frequent, systematic, and substantial is basically left to technical standards, and in this slide you find the fundamental concepts that underpin the underlying technical standards on the definition of a systematic internalizer. Remember, the idea is that this is an investment firm that provides execution of orders on its own account vis-à-vis the clients, which is an investment service. But when this is done on an organized, frequent, systematic, and substantial basis, this is a sort of a trading venue of a new trading venue because it is recognizable by the market as a permanent, stable and substantial liquidity and price formation provider on the market. So it is at that point our investment service of dealing on own account acquires a new status as an execution venue under MiFID. And technical standards will tell you when this happens, because it will tell you when you have an organized, frequent, systematic, and substantial basis. The overall picture that we have is that we now have trading on financial instruments carried out on different platforms, but subject to rules which are quite similar throughout this entire part of MiFID II. These rules provide sufficient and robust regulation and authorization of different trading systems, taking into account the distinctions that you have between the different kinds of trading systems that you find. We have very close and truly equivalent rules for regulated markets and MTFs, because these two trading venues effectively do exactly the same job. So there is no reason why there should be distinctions between rules applicable to regulated markets and MTFs from the MiFID perspective. But if you exit MiFID, there is a big distinction between directives from MiFID that are applicable to issuers that are listed on regulated markets or MTFs. You have a special status for OTFs, which are discretional, and you have, in particular, the rules that you apply to OTFs include conduct of business rules, best execution, and other conduct of business rules that are closer to the ones that you apply to investment services providers. And this is reasonable if you think about it, because in an OTF, the market operator has a discretionality in handling the orders that come on the platform. So OTFs are truly a hybrid between a trading venue and an investment service provider. So this is why for OTF market operators, this element of discretionality is the reason why for OTF operators you have additional conduct of business rules that reflect the approach that you find in MiFID in relation to investment services providers. Okay, so before I address the second part of today's presentation and discuss the trading obligations under MiFID II, I now leave the floor to the first group of today. So we have Daniele, Leonardo, and Hugo are going to present this very interesting and controversial decision in the Crédit Agricole case. Okay, you can start. You have 15 minutes for the presentation, and thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well. Good morning, Professor. Good morning, everyone. So, just a moment. I cannot see. What's the problem here?
Yeah, we can see the presentation, Daniele. It's
okay. So, as the professor said, we are going to introduce a very controversial case by the European Court of Justice, which refers to the direct application of national law by one European institution. So, in addition to the numerous power and responsibility on the ECB in relation to the European banking system, the SSM regulation contains a new and unprecedented provision for the European Union law. In fact, the SSM enables an European institution, the ECB in this case, to directly apply national law. More specifically, Article 4.3 of the SSM regulation clarified that the ECB scope of application of action is not limited to the union law, but at the same time, it includes national law to the extent that the latter is an outcome, is the transposition of a directive, or it results from the option and discretion left to the member state by European Union regulation. So, in this presentation, we consider the theoretical and practical implication of this provision, starting with the introduction of the case that I cited, the Credit Agricole case. So, in 2014, okay, I cannot check, okay. Professor, can you see the other slide? Because I have some, okay. Is the second slide? Yes.
Yes, Daniel.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I have some internet problem. Maybe I don't know. Sorry.
No, it's
so
okay.
In 2014, 4 regional banks of the Credit Agricole Group wished to appoint the same person both for the position of chairman of the board of directors and for the role of effective director. In response, the ECB approved the appointment of the person concerned as a chairman, but not as effective director, justifying its decision on the basis of the Capital Requirement Directive, the CRD, of 2013. Precisely, Article 48 of CRD prohibits that chairman can have simultaneously holding the position of a key executive officer in the same institution. This is a simple disposition because the controller cannot be at the same time the controlled person. Other than this, pursuant to Article 4.3 of SSM regulation, the European Central Bank took in account the relevant article of the French Monetary and Financial Code, which transposed Article 88 of CRD. Okay. And according to the Monetary and Financial Code, the function enabling a person to be recognized as an effective director are, among the others, the one of the chief executive officer. Finally, the European Court of Justice considered that ECB correctly interpreted the notion of effective director as defined both in the Capital Requirement Directive and in the French Monetary and Financial Code. Besides, the Court of Justice contextualized its judgment in the light of the previous sentence ruled by the French Supreme Court for Administrative Justice in 2014. So, to sum up, for the first time in the history of European Union integration, in one hand, an European institution directly applied national law while carrying out a task conferred on the European Central Bank by the European law. In the other one, the European Court of Justice interpreted the national law in the way in which a national authority did. And now I can leave the floor to Hugo for a more in-depth analysis of Article 4.3 of SSM regulation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Could you hear me?
Yes, Hugo.
Yes,
ahead.
Ugo.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you very much. So first of all, the SSMR deals with regulation in an original manner, as it relies on national laws and allowing EU institutions to make use of national law while carrying out its tasks. In order to better understand the originality of this regulation, let's look at 3 of its articles. First, we have Article 4.3 of the SSMR, which provides that the ECB is to apply all relevant union law while carrying out prudential supervisory powers over credit institutions and financial companies. Hence, the ECB can use directly applicable EU law, regulations, national law transposing EU law directives, and then national law exercising options granted to member states, which is in fact the indirect way to apply national law. Secondly, we have Article 6.5 of the SSMR, which allows the ECB to instruct national regulators on how to perform supervisory tasks and take supervisory decisions, meaning that the ECB has the power to instruct national regulators on how to apply national laws. And finally, we have Article 9.1 of the SSMR, which allows the ECB to instruct NSA to make use of law that is not transposing EU law on behalf of the ECB if the ECB itself lacks power to carry out the tasks conferred on it by the SSMR. In fact, these 3 articles leave space to some new, unprecedented problems about the interrelation between national and European law. Indeed, the ECB is faced with multiple national laws, which are highly fragmented, that could lead to the application of differing national laws, even when spurring from the directive. Often, it is not easy to distinguish national provisions that stems from application of an EU directive from others. Hence, what is the ECB applying? National provisions may also have to be interpreted, applied in a specific way due to domestic peculiarities. Then, we can ask ourselves, should the ECB disregard the national context of the provisions? The ECB might be also put in situations where member states do not have consistently transposed EU secondary acts of legislation. Thus, we can ask ourselves if it must transpose the directive. And finally, in the event of judicial review, also the European Court of Justice should deal with Article 4.3 and thereby apply national legislation. Thus, we can understand national law is applied in a supranational context. This is something never seen before and results in a reversal of perspective. In order to solve the problems arising from the interrelation between national and European law, it is necessary to take into consideration some guidance. Indeed, first, we can see that the SSMRs adhere to the primacy principle, through which the ECB could disapply any national rule that does not comply with the EU law, as to ultimately apply the same set of rules across all the member states. In fact, the ECB may also invoke the principle of sincere cooperation, under which the Union and the member states shall assist each other in carrying out tasks which flow from the treaty to justify favoring EU law over national law. Then we can observe that it may also be tempting for the ECB to directly apply provisions from the directive, rather than the national provisions implementing this directive. However, this ability is limited as set out in the case law of the CJU. Indeed, direct application of directives is confined to situations in which an individual's rights are violated by his member state's failure to implement a directive correctly and is subject to certain conditions. For example, that the provisions to be directly applied is unconditional and sufficiently precise. And finally, the ECB could refer to acts of the European Banking Authority. So after having seen the theoretical implication of this regulation, I will leave the floor to Leonardo, who will explain the practical implication that European regulator must face. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Hugo, and good morning to everyone. So let's try to have a look how we can model the interrelation between European national law under the scope of Article 4.3. So we have 5 scenarios. And the first one, the ECB just applies a national law that is transposing a directive, and there is no conflict between the two. In this case, the application of the national law ensure the respect of the directive, so there are no problems. But in another scenario, the ECB might have to apply a rule of domestic law that is transposing a directive. But this transposition conflicts with another directly applicable European law, such as an EU regulation. So we can say that even if this hypothesis seems to fall outside the scope of Article 4.3, the national rule would be illegitimate and therefore should be disapplied by the ECB, which in turn should apply the national law, the relevant union law, according to the primacy principle which Hugo cited before. In a third scenario, the ECB may apply a rule of domestic law, so not one that is spurring from a directive, just a rule of domestic law that conflicts with another directive. And this is quite a troubled case because the SSM regulation seems to impose that the ECB applies national law anyway, even if in contrast with EU law. But indeed, this situation would be legitimate in front of the European Court of Justice, according to the primacy principle too. So in this case, on the one hand, the ECB could not apply anything and just proceed with an infringement procedure, but this would be a complex solution from a legislative standpoint. Otherwise, the ECB might be provided with the power to disapply that domestic law in order to ensure compliance with the primacy principle. And therefore, in this case, the ECB will apply Article 4.3 only in a context where the primacy of EU law would be ensured. In a first scenario, the member state has not transposed with the prescribed deadlines the directive, as there is no domestic law implementing that directive. So the ECB, on the one hand, could just apply a national law that is existing on that topic. But this national law could not be there, and so the ECB might need to adopt a decision based on the non-transposed directive. So it should interpret the directive itself and apply it. So this could be a solution, but we have not had cases of this type the past years. In the last scenario, so we said that the ECB has the options to apply can apply the option and discretions left by EU to member states. But what if these options or discretions are left to national authorities? There is no legislation on that, in the sense that the ECB has no obligation to take measures consistent with the exercise of those options by the national competent authorities. And so if there is a problem of compatibility between the exercise of options and discretions left to the ECB and the ones left to the national competent authorities, the ECB would have itself the power to intervene by giving indication to the national competent authorities. So the ECB prevails on the national competent authorities. Thank you very much. The conclusion of the presentation. If you have any question, feel free to ask us.
Okay, thank you very much. This is indeed one of the most complex areas of the SSM and the banking union, and there are a lot of questions that are open, and at the moment what we can simply do is put the questions on the table and see what happens in the future, because we don't really have an answer to all of these topics. So let's go back to our trading venues, and we now have to look at the trading obligation, which has been introduced by MiFID II. The trading obligation is I like to say that it is a re-edition, revamping the old concentration rule in a new environment, however, but the idea is not so different from the one that underpinned the concentration rule under that we had before the MiFID I came up and disrupted this concentration rule. And it is not exactly the same. For instance, under MiFID II, the trading obligation only applies to equities and derivatives, whereby the old concentration rule was applicable to all kinds of financial instruments. But the idea is the same. The idea is that if securities are traded on a regulated market, on an MTF or an OTF, the orders should basically be executed on the trading venue, thereby providing the trading venue with more liquidity and therefore additional depth of the order book, and therefore better capacity to carry out the price formation mechanism. If you look at these two slides, you have a visual representation of how the trading obligation works for equity markets and for non-equity markets, which are basically the certain kinds of derivatives. It's pretty simple. Trading obligation would ultimately result in placing the duty to place orders on a trading venue, whereby the trading venue is either a regulated market or an MTF. But you see that also systematic internalizers are included in this part of the trading obligation. And this is why I was saying before that ultimately there is no true distinction between trading venues and execution venues such as systematic internalizers. And if you look at the trading obligation, it works exactly in the same way. There are additional rules, small distinctions between systematic internalizers and regulated markets and MTFs on the other side. For instance, systematic internalizers, since they are these are entities that execute orders on their own account, they publish quotes, their own quotes. They publish their own prices and they provide quotes to the market, whereby regulated markets and MTFs publish quotes coming from the traders that access the platform. But these are minor distinctions, and I think you shouldn't be too much concerned with them. The trading obligation has a wide scope, but there are cases where it does not apply. That's the right side of the slide. You still have, for equity instruments, exceptions to the trading obligation. And conceptually, these exceptions reflect and confirm the exceptions that existed in the concentration regime of the ISD. For instance, block orders, large size orders that cannot be regularly executed on the trading venues, and other exceptions that you find in the technical standards. More specifically, if you look at the slide, you will see that you have OTC transactions for orders that are non-systematic, ad hoc, irregular, and infrequent. Now, these are all terms that you find defined and explained in the technical standards. And it is not the case for you to look at them now, nor to study them, because they're very technical and they're too specific. But just keep in mind that you have, for particular kind of trades, the trading obligation would not apply and orders would be executed over the counter. The case for derivatives is pretty similar, and you have a trading obligation for derivatives on regulated markets, MTFs, and OTFs, in fact. So these are typical derivatives, are typically trading obligation would result in placing orders on OTFs as well. So you have the third trading venue coming in, and then you have special rules for systematic internalizers, and then exception for pure over-the-counter orders. But the conceptual approach is the same. Even some kind of derivatives need to be concentrated on regulated markets, MTFs and OTFs. Let me go back just to this slide, just to explain one detail. When we looked at the definition of organized trading facility, I actually skipped an important concept. Look at the definition. It says it's a multilateral system, which is not a regulated market or an MTF, and in which multiple third-party buying and selling interest in bonds, structured finance, and emission allowances or derivatives. Okay, so this is important for you to remember, because for basically political reasons, finding a compromise in the text of MiFID II, organized trading facilities do not include equity products. You see, the definition is limited to bonds, structured finance products, emission allowances, or derivatives. Okay, so let me go back to the trading obligation scheme. When you talk about equity markets, the reason why OTFs do not appear in this slide is that OTFs are not available for equity products. The definition of OTF excludes products, but includes derivatives. So this is why you find OTFs in the trading obligation for derivatives slide. Okay, I hope this is clear. Keep it in mind, because it's an important distinction. The reason why OTFs are not there for equity products, the definition excludes equity products, is basically the result of a big discussion and compromise under MiFID during the preparatory works of MiFID II. So what I'm saying by this is, ultimately, if you have a multilateral platform which has elements of discretionality in executing the orders coming in, but which deals with equity products, that will not be an MTF under MiFID, but it won't be neither an OTF. So it's actually a non-regulated trading platform, and it would be considered as OTC transactions. Okay, so it won't be an MTF because it is discretional, and it won't be an OTF because it's equity. So it's a loophole in the directive, and it might be that in the revision of MiFID II this loophole is closed, but it is there, and it's quite sort of tricky point, but it's important to have this distinction in mind. The other part, the remaining part of the slides, are all dedicated to the technological developments that have had an impact on MiFID II, particularly because MiFID II was drafted in a period where we had a strong surge towards algorithmic and high-frequency trading. And this surge is far from being over. The most recent statistics that I read on for instance, the impact of high-frequency trading on markets both in Europe and the United States are quite interesting and even surprising, because for instance, it seems that in the US more than 60% of the entire volume of trades that reach trading platforms, trading volumes, more than 60% is high-frequency trading. And in Europe, we are a little bit below that threshold, but nonetheless, there is a truly significant amount of high frequency trading volume on our European markets. Now, algorithmic and high frequency trading pose significant risks. They have advantages, obviously, because they increase the volume of orders, they provide markets with more liquidity and more efficient ways of handling and transmitting orders to the platform. But they raise risks. For instance, among these risks, you can cite systemic risks, because these systems produce orders on an automatic basis without any human intervention. And so they have the tendency to amplify market trends. If you have and this has been clearly visible since the beginning, and when you have a problem on the market, such as last year we had the pandemic crisis breaking up, you clearly saw that algo and high-frequency trading sort of amplify market trends. Markets were going down because investors were very, very worried with the impacts of the pandemic, and algo and high-frequency trading would then start operating and creating orders automatic by closing down open position, applying automatic stop-loss mechanisms, and so on. So they have a tendency to amplify and to create systemic risk. Also, they may create, if they turn out to work badly, not in a proper way, if an algorithm goes wrong, as in the famous case of Knight Capital, that triggered a big debate in the United States and then in Europe on algo and high frequency trading, it might be that the algo is not properly built up, it has some flaws, and then when something unexpected happens to the market, the algo goes a little bit crazy and starts producing orders and sending orders to the market in an uncontrolled manner. And this may obviously create destabilizing effects, and not just on the relevant market, but also on other markets that are on other trading platforms that are in some way interconnected or linked to the market which is directly affected by the anomaly in the algo trading. What happened in 2010 was very instructive. Knight Capital had a problem with its own algo trading that went crazy, and in less than a few minutes, the index in US, the entire index of the US markets crashed and decreased for more than 10% in a few minutes, which was quite staggering if you imagine the volume the volume of orders and the loss that this implies. This was due to a problem with algo trading, and high frequency trading amplified the market trend, even though high frequency traders were not really at the score of at the source of the problem. And then in 2012, Knight Capital experienced another loss of 440 million only in 45 minutes because of an algo trading malfunctioning. Okay, so what the approach that MiFID takes to algo and high frequency trading is the following. First of all, you have a definition of algo and high frequency trading within the directive, and they are pretty close. They refer to the production of orders, transmission of orders on the market through a computer algorithm with limited or no human intervention. So this is the common element between algo and high frequency trading. But you have high frequency trading when that algo produces orders and produces messages that are sent to the trading platforms in a very, very intensive way, high frequency. And when I speak about high frequency, and thanks to the recent development technologies, I mean thousands and thousands and thousands of orders sent on the market in nanoseconds. So the amount of orders and volume of orders that are can be the byproduct of high-frequency trading is truly staggering in terms of size. And this explains why we see that in the US, more than 60% of the overall amount of orders placed on markets are the byproduct of high-frequency trading. Because when high frequency comes on the market, hits the market, the impact that it has really overwhelming effect on the functioning of the trading platform. And traditional traders are not in a position to compete with high-frequency trading. So they have to sort of adapt their strategies to the impact of high-frequency trading coming on the market. These algorithms may be used for two different functions. You have algorithms that simply are used in order to identify the trading venue where orders need to be executed on by applying best execution. And these are devices whose acronym is AORs that are not considered as true algorithmic trading by the directive, because these are simply automatic order routing, AOR, automatic order routing systems, which means that orders are picked up by the investment firm, then the investment firm needs to decide where to execute that order on one trading venue or the other, and this would be done through an automatic screening of the conditions that are present on different trading venues, and orders would be executed through this automatic screening. But this is not considered as algorithmic trading. You have algorithmic trading when you have a device which actually optimizes order execution, the process of order execution, by determining parameters of the order, such as price, quantity. So at that point, you're not simply choosing the trading venue where you are executing the order through the algorithm, but you're actually using the algorithm is actually setting up the parameters of the order, such as price and quantity of the securities to be executed. When we say high-frequency trading produces a huge amount of orders, the directive and level 2 regulations give you additional clarification as to what we mean by that. For instance, and tells you that you have a high message intraday rate if you have an algorithm that sends to the market at least 2 messages per second with respect to a single financial instrument, and at least 4 messages per second with respect to all financial instruments. So it's a pretty low threshold, because the amount of messages that high-frequency traders transmit to the market is significantly higher than this threshold, which means that there are quite a number of people affected by rules on high-frequency trading, and not just on algo trading. But high-frequency trading is only, the rules on high-frequency trading only apply to proprietary trading on liquid instruments. So you won't have high-frequency trading rules if high-frequency trading is used for non-proprietary trading, but that might fall under the algo trading part of it. Now, there is a duty, the approach that the directive takes once it has given us the definition of algo trading and high-frequency trading is not really to control directly how the algorithm is set out. It does not provide, for instance, technical standards as to how these algorithms should be construed. It doesn't give a benchmark. This is left to the market, and in fact, it is right to do so, because producing algorithms is a very expensive activity, and an algorithm is truly part of the industrial secrets of a financial instrument. So it makes sense for this part to be left in the hands of investment services providers. What the directive asks, however, is that the algorithm is sound, it is resilient, it is accessible to supervisors in case of inquiries and investigations. It is basically an approach that wants to avoid the risk that these algorithms run out of the hands of those who have produced it and may have an impact on the market as disruptive as, for instance, in the flash crash of 2010. So what you find in this part of the directive on algo and high frequency, after the definition, you have a description of the possible strategies that you may see employ algo trading or high frequency. These techniques may be used in market making, they may be used for statistical arbitrage purposes, they may be used as forms of liquidity detection. Some of these algorithms are able to detect the sort of differences, small differences between prices of the securities on different trading venues, and then you would have arbitrage, or they would be able to detect opportunities in terms of liquidity which is available for a certain instrument on one trading venue or the other. So they may be employed for different techniques, and all of these are acceptable for MiFID II, but they need to be controlled. So you have comprehensive rules as to how these algorithms are sort of controlled and managed properly by the investment firm that produces. And these rules look at two different sides of the market. You have rules applicable to investment firms that produce and use these algorithms for trading or high frequency, and that's part A. But you also have rules that apply to trading venues that accept these trading techniques on their side. And in both cases, if you look at the slide, you see that these are rules that refer to the capacity of managing and monitoring properly the application of these algo and high frequency techniques. So for instance, investment firms must be able to prove that when they use algo and high frequency trading, they have properly tested their algorithm. They have properly tested, they have applied a methodology that ensures that the algorithm does not go out of order, that it is resilient, and that something like the flash crash of 2010 is unlikely to happen. And this control needs to be carried out on a preliminary basis when the algorithm is built up, but it also implies ongoing controls over time as to how these algorithms concretely function on a regular basis. Trading venues are subject to a similar conceptual approach, so they need to have in place appropriate standards so that they can really assess, depending on whether the algo trading is used for market making, for liquidity, for arbitrage, to have appropriate controls and also qualified staff to supervise what happens on the trading venue as a consequence of algo and high frequency trading. If a trading venue feels that it is not in a position to provide sufficient controls and standards for these techniques, it should not accept algo and high frequency trading orders on its own trading venue. So you have both sides of the problem. You have intermediaries, investment firms, and trading venues cooperating together in order to provide an environment which is appropriate for algo and high frequency trading. For trading venues, this also means that the trading platform needs to have sufficient capacity, sufficient technological capacity to handle such a huge flow of orders in a very short period of time as the ones that might be the result of high-frequency trading. And this is something that falls under the responsibility of the trading venues that must take into account this particular aspect. And there are additional rules tied to these topics, such as co-location, direct electronic access, tick size, and fee structure, that are quite tricky, especially for high-frequency trading. For instance, co-location, you have rules on co-location. Co-location means that since high-frequency trading in nanoseconds, you have orders on the market, the swiftness and velocity of the order transmission flow to the market is essential. You need to have very robust and very fast channels of data transmission, including optical fiber, but I imagine that technological evolution is now sort of in a new area. It is entering into a new area. So there are rules that apply to the provision of services that allow market participants to use spaces that are physically very close to the trading infrastructure. It is true that optical fiber is very fast in sending orders to the market, but it's also true that you need to be as close as possible. Okay, and then additional provisions in terms of tick size and fee structures applicable to these trading venues. Yeah, now disregard slide number 31 because it is not part of what I was looking forward to explaining today. So forget about slide 31. We can stop here, and I now leave the floor to the second group presentation, and you can upload your slides and take the floor. Yeah, okay, we have the ECB 2020's rep.
Yes, can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay, so good morning to everybody. In this presentation, we will talk about the 2020's rep aggregate result. But before starting, we must know what rep is. So we already know that the most important element to ensure the soundness of a bank is the availability of sufficient capital to absorb unexpected losses. So in the European area, a three-pillar approach is established. The first pillar establish common minimum requirements for all credit institutions, while the second pillar allows supervisors to impose additional capitals referred to specific risks that each bank has. The supervisory review and the evaluation process is the core activity of the Pillar 2. And here, each bank is evaluated under four different angles that are the business model, governance and risk, capital, and liquidity. In the SREP decision, which the supervisor sends to the bank at the end of the process, key objectives are set to address the identified issues. In fact, we have the Pillar 2 requirement, which is imposed in addition to the minimum capital requirement, and it is binding, and also the Pillar 2 guidance that indicates to the bank the adequate level of capital to be maintained to provide a sufficient buffer to withstand the stressed situation. So unlike the P2R, the P2G is not legally binding. The SREP is performed by different supervisors for significant and less significant institutions. In fact, the significance criteria are size, economic importance, cross-border activities, and also direct public financial assistance. That is, if the bank has received public funding. For less significant institutions, the SREP is performed by national competent authorities, while for significant institutions is performed by the joint supervisory teams. Each JST is responsible for carrying out the SREP for the entities it supervises. And the SREP decisions may include capital requirement, such as P2R and P2G, but also quantitative liquidity requirements and other qualitative supervisory measures, such as follow-up on-site inspections. Now we can analyze the 2020 SREP results.
Okay, thank you, Ale. So let's have first a look at how banks entered the pandemic crisis. The graphs that are at the bottom of the slide show some aggregate metrics for 110 directly supervised banks from the ECB. And the graph at the bottom left shows the evolution of the CET1 ratio in the past 5 years. As you can see from the graph, banks have entered the crisis in a very good prudential shape. Just to give a very quick comparison, they entered the crisis with a CET1 ratio that it was at an average of 14, 15, while at the beginning of the crisis, they were at 8%. This has mainly been due thanks to the prudential shape requirements in the past years, but also thanks to the exceptional policy measures that have supported the economy, such as public loan guarantees, in monetary policy interventions, and also the high levels of supervisory reliefs, flexibility. At the bottom right graph, you can see the evolution of the liquidity coverage ratio that not only was well above the 100% minimum requirement, but also increased during the 2020 year. Okay, so in an exceptional environment, they decided to take an exceptional decision, the ECB, that is to face the SREP 2020 with a pragmatic approach. So just to give two figures in which banks have operated, but we have all lived, the GDP is forecast to come back to pre-COVID levels not before the end of 2022, as recently the European Commissioner for the Economy, Paolo Gentiloni, has recently remarked. And also, the KEYS indicator, that is a widely used indicator to measure the uncertainty of the financial markets, has spiked to Brexit comparable levels. So the idea of the pragmatic approach is to ensure a structural assessment of the directly supervised banks, but also relaxing the usual strict requirements of a normal SREP cycle. So the 4 elements that have been mentioned before by Alessandro have been assessed, but with a focus on the capacity of the banks to handle the crisis and to manage its impact in the coming months. Okay, now related to the ECB relief measures, Andrea Enria, that is the chair of the ECB Supervisory Board, announced at the beginning of March 2020 some measures to support the normal activity of the banks, that is to support the real economy from people to corporate borrowers. This has resulted in a bigger headroom for banks, that is the difference between the capital ratio and the minimum requirements. So as you can see from the graph at the top left, or at the top right, you can see how the headroom has increased during 2020. The first element is about dividend restrictions. At the beginning of the crisis, ECB imposed a total ban on dividends, but according to last December revision, ECB decided to allow dividends for an amount below 15% of the aggregate 2019 and 2020 profit. Regarding the IFRS 9 transitional arrangements, the idea was to smooth the impact from an incurred credit loss model to an expected credit loss model that is forward-looking. So in the pandemic scenario, these new models would have meant banks to put aside too much provisions, since are models that are regarding the future expected losses. So ECB gave guidance regarding this point. The last three green rectangles are about the existing capital buffers that have been relaxed for the 2020 year. The first one is about the P2R composition, since the ECB allowed to use also some elements that are not part of the CET1 ratio to meet the P2R requirements. And the last two are about P2G relief and macroprudential buffers relief, and the ECB gave the possibility to operate below these buffers. Now it's the turn to Paola and Cassia that will show in more detail the risks that have been seen by ECB.
Exactly. So let's now turn to the vulnerabilities that have been identified by SREP 2020. For instance, these vulnerabilities have been categorized into some main areas of supervisory concern, of which the first one is the business model concerns, where concerning findings have actually increased by 105% compared to the previous year. Then internal governance and credit risk, which has been identified as a concern for 80% of all the supervised banks, especially with regards to the identification, measurement, and management of credit risk. This can also be seen from the figure on the right, where we see a comparison of the SREP findings for the years 2020 and 2019, where we see that the divergence in credit risk is the most prominent one. Then banks, due to the pandemic shock, are also preparing for asset deterioration, since the cost of risk has been increasing and also many effects of the pandemic have not been realized yet. This relates to one of the peculiarities that emerged from SWEP 2020, which is the lag in reaction of non-performing loans, as non-performing loans, due to the COVID shock, have been sort of forecasted to increase, but this increase has actually not taken place yet, probably due to a time lag. And then another peculiarity reconnects to what Marco just mentioned, is that in contrast with the global financial crisis, the pandemic shock actually does not involve any liquidity issues, as for instance, the liquidity coverage ratio has been higher and has been following an increasing trend. So now turning to the first concern, which regards the business model, and this emerged due to the fact that profitability has dropped due to the pandemic crisis, and this has numerous causes, such as, for example, the higher impairment flows, which actually have been 150% higher in the first half of 2020 compared to 2019. Then there has been a decrease in the net income of banks due to both loan moratoria, but also due to lower lending rates, which are fueled by a lower for longer interest rate environment we're in at the moment, and then also due to the decrease in fees and commissions and the increase in provisioning needs. All of these factors have led the return on equity of banks to approach zero. So in response of these concerning findings, some suggestions that have been given are to sort of engage, make banks engage in broader strategic overhauls, in restructuring plans such as digitalization of internal services, banking services, IT investments, and cost-cutting measures, such as, for example, as we can see in the bottom right figure, such as a decrease in full-time employees and branch consolidation. Thus, basically, a response that was given due to these findings of SREP 2020 was to push banks to modify their business models. Then the second concern regards internal governance, and this concern is caused by the fact that during the pandemic, banks have managed to adapt their governance arrangements adequately to manage and monitor risk, but in some cases there have been some gaps or incongruencies that have hindered the efficiency of banks. And for instance, in some cases, banks have been rather slow in adapting to to the challenges that arose due to the COVID-19 shock. And this slowness, let's say, was caused by inadequate involvement of the management body, nor sufficient follow-up and oversight of business functions, such as, for example, bottom-up decisions. Then it was also caused by issues of credit risk management, especially within internal control functions, and due to a structural weakness within the risk data aggregation and reporting, which was not only time-wise, but also quality-wise. Thus, also in this case, some suggestions and recommendations have been given, which we can see in the figure on the right, where 28% of the recommendations regarded an improvement in internal control functions, and the other two biggest sectors were with 14% each, data aggregation and risk reporting, and finally, the oversight role of management body.
Now we will have a look at the credit risk component. So the premise here is that there's hidden distress in the loan books. This can be evidenced by the fact that the amount of non-performing loans has actually decreased in 2020, as you can see in the top right corner. This is mainly due to extraordinary public support measures that were implemented in 2020. However, it is expected that as soon as these public support measures expire, there will be an increase in the non-performing loans. So the main vulnerabilities that have been identified relate to, one, the credit risk monitoring and classification. So banks seem to be unprepared to tackle the problems that will arise from the asset quality deterioration. Moreover, multiple guidelines for IFRS 9 as well as loan moratoria have been brought forward. Banks are recommended to take long-term economic forecasts and look at the effects on the probability of default as well as the expected credit losses. However, there are multiple signs that there's only a slow or no recognition at all of credit risk and therefore limited IFRS 9 classification. Similarly, with the risks relating to loan moratoria, which are not being identified, classified, or monitored effectively. Which brings us to the second point, the management of cliff effects. Cliff effects are extremely dangerous as only small margins differentiate banks from being seen as healthy and from running into problems. So the banks are unprepared for the time after the public support measures. Moreover, multiple loans face forbearance exposures, so loans that are where borrowers are not sure that they will meet the repayment obligations, and therefore the loans will have to be remodified. However, very few of those loans are actually being monitored right now, and therefore banks are running into risk. And lastly, I would like to drag your attention to the case of diversified lenders. As you can see in the bottom right corner, they have a very high non-performing exposure as well as very high levels of loans that met the EBA loan moratoria criteria. And these two mean that those diversified lenders run increased risk of being severely affected by such cliff effects. Moving on to capital adequacy, ICAAP, and other. Since banks entered the crisis in a much better place, it was able to introduce a couple of capital relief measures. So the front loading of the P2R actually resulted in a decrease of the CET1 requirements. However, the actual decrease was around 30 basis points instead of the intended 90 basis points, since shortfalls in Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 had to be covered. Moreover, credit risk impairment affected the capital ratio of banks. This is especially problematic for banks with limited capital headroom, so banks that operate only slightly above the capital requirements, and these banks are being advised to revise the capital planning. And lastly, ICAAP weaknesses have been identified. This mainly relates to the unreliability of credit projections, and this obviously has direct effects on the capital planning as well as the framework for the stress testing. Moving on to other, there has been an overdependence on third parties for banking services. Moreover, there's a clear need to improve IT as well as cybersecurity. The wider consequences of internal governance include the money laundering or the financing of terrorism, for example. And lastly, also for less significant institutions, very similar vulnerabilities have been identified.
Okay, thank you very much. You were slightly longer than the 15 minutes, but the topic was very complex, and I am, I must say, amazed by the presentation, because you managed to take into account a very, very technical part, which is the SREP exercise. And good. Thank you very much. I will see you again on Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.